Hello and welcome to This Week in the Triangle. My name is Stephen Horn. I am an independent journalist here in North Carolina. Let's talk about some news from the Greater Triangle area of North Carolina that happened over the past week. First story we have here is out of Wake County. So we have a couple instances that have been reported over the past month, which is known as Pride Month, of these rainbow or pride flags being vandalized or stolen. So we have an incident in Raleigh, Cary, and Apex. Now, what's interesting about these is honestly kind of how they haven't been focused on. So these are reported on in the mainstream media, at least in WRAL. But there's a time when stories like this could make national news. When someone's stealing LGBTQ flags. There's a story I think in Atlanta where some teenagers were vandalizing one of these rainbow crosswalks. But here, it's sort of interesting that there are several incidents of this which appear to all be unrelated, and yet that kind of flew under the radar a little. So, this first story we have here was from, it was actually a week from last Saturday. So this was at a roundabout next to the NC State campus where a man was, I guess he was spotted pulling up these small rainbow flags that were at the roundabout. A woman saw him. There was some sort of altercation and the police were called, but it does not appear the charges were actually filed in this case. And we have an image here. I don't know how they'll show up. But apparently, one of the passerbys took an image of this person, who is alleged to have done this with the flags. So once again, it's not really clear what the motivation is, based on the fact that these pride flags are intended to convey a message. You can infer that the purpose of this was to counter that message, to remove it. But kind of odd that we don't even have more details on that. And so, as to the other two incidents earlier in the month, multiple residents of the Iron Gate neighborhood in Cary reported their pride flags and possibly also a Ukraine flag being stolen from in front of their homes. It does not appear that there's any suspect identified in this case. But for the third incident, or I guess several incidents, but the third perhaps perpetrator, is that there's a report of a man named Nelson Julio de Abreu Santana. I'm probably butchering that name. Basically taking some pride flags that an LGBTQ fitness group had put up in a park in Apex to mark where they meet. So there's some video of him taking the flag, throwing it in the woods. I guess the police were called with this incident. He was arrested and charged with 2 counts of injury to personal property. So we have some mug shots here of Nelson Santana. Since that arrest for the injury to personal property, he has also been charged twice with trespassing, one of which he pled guilty to and was sentenced to 1 day in jail, time served. So apparently he hasn't been doing too well since that June 4th arrest. Especially as one of those trespassing charges was at the apartment complex, which was listed as his residence when he was first charged. Now his residence is listed as anywhere on the second 2 charges, suggesting that he may be homeless at this point in time. It's sort of interesting, you had these 3 incidents all in Wake County. I guess the question is, does this suggest that sort of, public opinion may be changing on the acceptability of Pride Month? Is our incidents like this becoming more normal, where it's just sort of an outright rejection of the open celebration of Pride Month? I don't know. It could be, but I guess we'll have to wait and see on that one. And our next story here is also from Raleigh. This is one that we've covered a bit in the past as well, which is 2 North Carolina State Highway Patrol troopers have been dismissed after they were caught up in this scandal where they were caught sort of communicating together and discussing how to deceive the Raleigh police about the crash of a drunk driver, which ended his life. So, what happened was this was in the fall of last year, middle of the night on, I believe it was October 7th, 2024. A man named Tyrone Mason was flying down Capitol Boulevard heading out of Raleigh. He had a blood alcohol level of 0.11 above the legal limit. And so a state highway patrol trooper who was parked at a gas station on Capitol, Trooper Garrett Macario, he sees him flying along. So he pulls out, turns on his lights, tries to pull him over. So he has his lights and sirens on for about 30 seconds. But Mason, the driver he's attempting to pull over, he doesn't stop. So Macario turns off his lights and sirens. But when he comes around the next curve, he sees that Mason has crashed. His car is on the other side of Capitol Boulevard. He's crossed, both lanes of traffic. Actually, no actual traffic there in the early hours of the morning. So he turns around, brings his car around. He looks. He says that guy is DRT, or dead right there. That's his assessment, is that the drunk driver Mason died on impact. So he calls Raleigh police, lets them know that there is a crash, but he doesn't really give them too many details, because what he does next is call his supervisor, who is Sergeant Matthew Morrison, and basically tells him what's going on. Hey, I briefly tried to pull over this person, but he was just flying past. He tells him he was going 70 and a 40, so 70 miles per hour down Capitol Boulevard. This is what he tells his superior officer. But he says, I tried to pull him over. It wasn't working. I didn't want to do this high-speed chase, so I turned my lights off. Next thing I know, I come around the corner. He has crashed. And so basically what Morrison tells him is, this is the quote, Morrison, I wouldn't mention anything to them about you trying to stop him. And that is about the Raleigh police. So the Raleigh police are responding. They're on their way. Morrison says, don't mention anything. And so Macario says, no, I won't. So basically, just tell them that you drove up on it, which was technically true, but don't tell them that you had attempted to pull him over right before. Presumably just to avoid trouble for themselves, because the dash cam shows that is exactly what happened. He didn't. This wasn't some sort of hit maneuver or something where he caused the crash. No, he was out of sight of Mason's vehicle when it crashed. And so Macario followed Morrison's advice or instruction. And so when Raleigh police asked him, were you pulling him over or something? That was literally the question they asked. And he said no, which was not telling the truth to the Raleigh police. And that is what they got in trouble for. So the Wake County District Attorney Lauren Freeman opened an investigation, ultimately did not press charges against these two officers. But what she did do is dismiss about 180 cases they are involved in, because if you're an officer and your testimony is unreliable, that is something the defense can and will use, and that is something that has to be disclosed to the defense if a particular law enforcement officer, if there is evidence of their unreliable testimony. So these cases were dismissed, and there is an internal investigation opened by the State Highway Patrol as well, and that is the investigation that resulted in their dismissal. Now, Macario is also being sued. The family of Mason, the drunk driver who once again crashed his vehicle because he appears to have been speeding. He was out of sight of the police officer when he drove across traffic, crashed his vehicle, died right there. His family is suing the officer, saying basically there's no evidence to support this, but they're saying he crashed because the officer attempted to pull him over. Now, it's my humble opinion that if an officer attempts to pull you over and you speed off, whatever happens because of your reckless driving, that's on you. It is your choice not to pull over, and it is your responsibility for anything that happens because you're not pulling over. If you're driving drunk, you're driving recklessly, you're driving too fast, you crash, that is 100% totally on you. That is not on the officer who's attempting to pull you over for speeding. but they are represented from some by some notorious lawyers, some of them who are known for inflaming racial tension, such as Ben Crump. If I recall correctly, he was involved in the Breonna Taylor lawsuit, some other high profile cases, because the two officers who have now been dismissed are white, and Mason, who was driving drunk, was black. So to them, there's going to be a whole racial thing. It's a civil rights thing, and they're trying to make a big deal out of it, probably to try to get some sort of payout. Now they're suing Macario directly. I don't. I don't believe any of the agencies have been named in the lawsuit yet. So I'm not sure if they're trying to get out of it. I'm guessing, a North Carolina State Highway Patrol trooper probably doesn't have really the assets to pay anything. Maybe there's some sort of insurance there, but I'm not sure with that situation. And so our next story here is an instance of a grassroots protest that was actually effective. I cover a whole lot of protests that go down in Raleigh because that is the state capital. All sorts of groups like to protest there. And what nearly all of these protests have in common is that they do not affect any practical or policy change. So different groups come to the Capitol all the time. Sometimes it's directed at the legislature. Sometimes they're just marching around the streets. Some of the recent ones have been anti-Trump protests. Guess what? Trump doesn't care if you're marching around in Raleigh. There's gun control protests. Various Democrat causes are the norm. It seems like Democrats are a little bigger into protesting than Republicans are, definitely from my experience. But generally, these protests, the main effect of them is that the people feel good about protesting. Sometimes there's a media element too. Sometimes they want to get attention for a particular cause, but usually protesting is it's mainly about how you feel after having protested. It that's the main effect. It's not actual change. But this week, shrimpers actually came to Raleigh, rallied at the legislature, drove their I guess shrimp transportation trucks around the legislature to protest a last minute amendment to an unrelated bill passed by the North Carolina Senate that would have basically banned shrimping. So it would have banned trawling in inland waters and anything within half a mile of the coast. So this was put into a bill that was actually intended to expand the fishing regulations for flounder, and I believe it was uh, red snapper. So the House had passed a bill to expand flounder and red snapper fishing. The Senate, before they passed it, they put in this provision related to heavily restrict shrimp trawling and passed it. So just 2 days after the amendment, the Senate passed it. That was on June 19th. And so basically the shrimpers and the people who supported them, they're able to, kind of build a grassroots movement very quickly, head to the Capitol, talk to their representatives, make a lot of noise about that. And the House decided to basically send it to committee to die. And so, this was kind of one of those instances where the people protested, the representatives listened, and it actually worked. That ban will not be passed. So why did this particular protest work when most protests don't? Well, the protest is a signifier to the representative that a lot of people care about an issue, because for every person who is willing to actually drive to Raleigh and show up in person, there are any number of potential people who would consider that issue and how they vote, but not quite enough to actually come and protest in person. So it's sort of like a multiplier effect. It can give the representatives some issue that this is an issue that might actually affect the electoral outcomes. But the second key point is that it is nonpartisan. This is not an issue that was already split along partisan lines. It's not an issue that they ran on. For instance, if you are either a Democrat or a Republican, your position on guns is most likely going to be somewhere in your platform. If it's Republican, you're going to be open about the fact that you're pro-gun. If you're a Democrat, you're going to be open about the fact that you're anti-gun. So if you're a Republican and members of your district are protesting, saying, we don't like guns. Well, as a Republican, that's not really going to affect anything you do because you've already taken that into account. You know, those people who don't support guns, they're not going to support you. It doesn't matter. That's not sending any signal about your electoral chances. So if you have a protest against something like, just against Trump or against immigration enforcement, like some of the big protests we've seen in Raleigh, that's the politicians aren't really going to. It doesn't have much weight to them because the issue is already tried at the ballot box and Trump won. So when you have a Democratic mandate, holding a protest against the Democratic mandate isn't going to convince them that you actually have the Democratic support behind you, because it was already tested at the ballot box and found that no, that cause did not have Democratic support. So with this shrimp protest, that's I think that's really the key issue, is that this is not an issue that had already become partisan. The Republicans weren't running for this or against this. The Democrats weren't running for or against this. And it was also, a very sympathetic cause, because this would negatively impact a big industry. And it was done with, it was a surprise. They sort of tried to slip it in at the last moment for who knows why. I'm not sure anyone has really come up with definitive proof of why they even tried to do this. But if you're going to decimate an industry, you should at least give them some notice, have hearings, make it public. And there just wasn't that transparency here. So then when it came to the House, that's a much more sympathetic cause, to say, hey, you should shut this down. There's no upside for you to pass that, and there's a big downside of all your constituents that this will hurt. So that is, my 2 cents on what an effective protest is, because the effectiveness of a protest, it doesn't really necessarily depend on how many people you're able to get out, because it's more about the circumstances surrounding the issue. So if it's an issue that's already highly politicized, it doesn't necessarily matter how many people you bring out there, because it's already taken into account in the democratic and the electoral math that savvy politicians are doing in their head. It's really, but if it's an issue like this that is not politicized, then showing your representatives that people care about this, that people may vote based on this issue in the future, is may actually provide some incentive for them to change their mind and to take action that they would not have otherwise taken. And our final story also happens to be from Raleigh, is a no war on Iran protest. So this is a fairly small protest compared to some of the left-wing protests organized by these same groups. About 40 or 50 protesters in Raleigh. They're marching to support Palestine, to oppose Israel, and to oppose the U.S. military support for Israel in attacking the Iranian nuclear facilities. So this was billed as both all eyes on Gaza and no war on Iran. Sort of one of these intersectional causes where they lump multiple things together. So if you're opposing, military action, then obviously you must also be supporting Gaza, because that's just how they think about things. They there are definitely people on the right who just oppose war for the sake of opposing war, not because of any of this neo-Marxist settler colonial stuff or anything like that, which is why the radical leftists tend to oppose Israel, because this event was organized in conjunction with the Answer Coalition and chapters of the Palestinian Youth Movement, Jewish Voice for Peace, Democratic Socialists of America, and the Party for Socialism and Liberation. And some of these groups are the same ones that have been organizing on the UNC campus, especially for the past, I guess, over a year at this point. There was the big encampment, quite a few arrests there. We reported on that. We reported on how those cases turned out. But the socialists, the two socialist groups, Democratic Socialists and the Party for Socialism and Liberation, have also been active in organizing these anti-immigration enforcement protests, which have brought a lot more people out in the streets, in the thousands, as opposed to 40 or 50 for this, which kind of shows that most most Americans don't care. There's a lot more people, whether or not they're Americans, there's a lot more people in America that care about immigration enforcement and not enforcing immigration laws than there are that care about bombing Iranian facilities. That's all the stories for this week. If you want to get this newsletter that I'm going through in your inbox each week, maybe you're a little bit more of a reader, you can go to triangletrumpet.news. So I publish this at the Triangle Trumpet. I cover local news in the Greater Triangle area of North Carolina. Try to cover some news that the mainstream media doesn't, and try to cover it in a way that they don't, without the corporate liberal bias. That's at Triangle Trumpet news. If you're tuning in, thanks for listening.